President Biden made a surprise visit to Ukraine, spending time in the capital city of Kiev, where he promised an additional $500 million in aid on top of the tens of billions of dollars the U.S. has already committed. Biden also announced that America was set to impose additional sanctions on Russia with a focus on the energy sector. The visit came on the eve of the one-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Biden's visit also preceded a major speech planned for today from Poland, in which he was expected to frame the war as a battle for democracy and reiterate his, and thus America's, unwavering commitment to backing Ukraine in the war. Also today, Russian leader Vladimir Putin is expected to deliver a speech making his case for the war, that it is a program of denazification, that it is essential to warding off a threat from NATO, and that it is aimed at reclaiming historical Russian territory, whatever it takes. In short, both leaders are expected to say that they will continue the war until the other one backs down. The result is going to be what the New York Times called a split-screen moment with Cold War parallels, a showdown of sorts between two aging Cold Warriors, one 70 years old and another who just turned 80, who've been circling each other for years and are now engaged in everything short of direct battle. So to start today, I just want to go around the panel and gauge a reaction to Biden's visit and to America's continuing commitment to backing Ukraine in the war. Nick, let's start with you.
I think Biden's visit is fine. He was the last of the major kind of European leaders to actually go to Ukraine. I think our aid is too much and it needs more controls on it. It's not a good thing to be getting into a war, a little bit at a time, like Biden is slipping into a bath that's a little bit too warm for his wrinkled skin. The other thing, I just want to say real quick in the summary that you read, it's really fucking dangerous to keep personalizing these kinds of events. This isn't Putin versus Biden. It's the United States and a bunch of Western nations versus Russia. And just like in the Cold War, there was always an attempt to try and link everything to the personalities of a couple of leaders, one of whom may not even be popularly elected. That's really dangerous. And we need to be focusing on the broader forces that are leading to this kind of standoff.
I think that's fair, although I do also think that Biden and Putin are inevitably the personifications of their nation's policy objectives here. America is doing what Biden wants in Ukraine, and Russia is doing what Putin wants to some degree. It's obviously not just them, but they are pivotal figures here. Catherine, what was your reaction to Biden's Ukraine visit?
I read a bunch of the kind of mainstream coverage of it. And one thing that I was struck by was everyone wants it to be Cold War parallels, but some of the framing actually struck me much more as Iraq War parallels on Putin's side of things. So the New York Times wrote, Vladimir Putin, who a year ago this week believed the Ukrainian capital would become a Russian-controlled territory in a matter of days, moving Mr. Putin closer to his ambition of restoring the empire of Peter the Great, right? And I do think there is something to be gleaned there of, the idea that Putin thought he was going to sweep in, take over, get the job done, get out cleanly. Maybe also a little World War I energy there, a little like this war will be brief and provide opportunities for valor. And then, everyone had trench foot and it was really sad. So I think that there is the temptation to go Cold War parallel is there, but there are many other parallels. Of course, parallels to all wars are bad news in the end because they're still wars. And the other thing I was struck by was many, many quotes that had some variation of, if this war lasts like a really, really long time, Russia has the upper hand. And that's just manifestly true, right? Like there is an expiration on the tolerance of the U.S. Congress, among other things, for financially backing this war. And Putin will do this literally until the day he dies. And I think that was obvious from the beginning. And it's weird to me that we're still doing the, kind of to be sure in mainstream coverage of this war.
I saw a bunch of those quotes, too, although several of them that I saw were caveated with Russia will have the upper hand if this lasts for a long time. That is, if the United States and NATO back down. And it basically framed this as a war between Russia and the NATO-U.S. coalition, where it was the NATO-U.S. resolve that mattered actually in some ways more than Ukraine itself. Zach, what was your reaction to the visit?
Well, I agree with Catherine that this has, in a way, demystified both Putin and kind of the might of the Russian military. There was a lot of early speculation that they were just going to roll all the way into Kyiv, and that obviously didn't happen. And it's all part of a demystification that's happened across the world, really. I mean, Trump, I think, taking power in the U.S. had that effect on many Americans' view of our federal government, certainly the executive branch, and now with kind of the decline of Biden there. The might of the U.S. is also in question, and that's why that's one reason I would really reject the Cold War comparison. Most of the Cold War played out before I was born, but just from my understanding of history, there was an appetite for military spending and a kind of post-World War II belief in American might and the federal government being somewhat competent. The space race was really exciting for people. Communism was a clear and obvious threat. And I think now none of that's there. We're on the heels of 2 decades of Middle East wars with very little show for it. Trust and confidence in the federal government's extremely low, and for very good reason. And Russia is a threat to Eastern Europe, but it's so far removed from the power of the Soviet Union and not driven by the pernicious ideology of communism that Americans rightly saw as a threat to their way of life. The main parallel I see with the Cold War at this point is the occasional and terrifying saber rattling about the use of nuclear weapons.
Yeah, so I agree with that. This isn't Cold War II, Cold War harder, right? It's not a direct sequel. It's more like the
Legend of Curly's Gold.
Cold War II,
exactly
Electric Boogaloo.
City Slickers 2.0 rather than Die Hard 2.
Yeah, so Nick, I want to ask you about Die Hard 2. No, I don't, actually. I want to ask
Yes, you do.
I like it. It's an Easter movie. We need more Easter movies.
One of the only movies set at the Dulles Airport. Now, normally we give the Biden tweets to Catherine, but today I want to read a White House tweet. So it's technically from the White House official accounts, and I'll read that to you and then ask you about
all
that.
On edge, waiting to hear it.
Yeah, so the tweet is, today, President Biden is in Kyiv to reaffirm America's unwavering commitment to Ukraine's democracy, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. The United States of America will stand with the Ukrainian people for as long as it takes. And I want to focus in on 2 little passages there. One is just one word, unwavering. And the second is the final set of words, as long as it takes. So does this sound more than a little like an unofficial declaration of war, or at least proxy war, on the part of the United States against Russia? I mean, an unlimited commitment to backing a war. Sounds like you're a participant in the war. It sounds like we're at war. What do you make of this?
I think that what that is about, it's 2 tracks. One is that it is a message to Putin. That along with the rest of Europe, the United States is not going to sit idly by when territorial, integrity is broken. And the other thing that he's doing, because and I'm sure we'll get to this, but as 2024 looms, what he is doing is he is setting out an agenda that the Republicans will respond to in Congress. And I think, almost always foreign policy in the United States is a function of domestic policy. And what he's trying to do is to define the Republican Party as a pro-Putin party with this kind of rhetoric. Because when people say, and Republicans, they haven't figured out how to do this quite yet, because they love the wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And they love the American military, and now they're going to be saying, no, we need less of that. Are they going to talk about cutting defense spending? Biden has, last year as well as this year, he's looking at record-setting budget calls for the Defense Department and things like that. I think that tweet is as much about domestic policy and setting creating a difference between him and the likely Republican candidates for president.
Zach, is there a way to back down from this without caving in to Russia's territorial aggression? I mean, Putin is in the wrong here. Russia's war is a war of aggression. There's no justification for it. So how should the U.S. respond to such a flagrant violation of international norms, not to mention human rights abuses, just like also killing an awful lot of people in a war for territory? Like, what should the United States, first of all, maybe one way of thinking about this question is, what should the United States have done from the beginning? But now that we're in the position we're in, what should we do now?
Yes. So Nick and I actually talked with Emma Ashford about this question. She is in the realist camp, and I have an increasing level of sympathy towards that idea that we need to assess the fact that, or recognize the fact that the U.S. is by far the largest monetary and weapons contributor to Ukraine at this end. With that comes a responsibility to think about the end game from the beginning. And, unfortunately, there's, no fairy tale ending here where Russia, I think, gets pushed back beyond that Russia gains no territory whatsoever. There's going to be some sort of compromise. I cannot say what that is going to be. But so far, the U.S. has shown zero interest in kind of flexing that power they have as a provider and backer of Ukraine to bring the parties to the table to try to broker that. And that's what's concerning to me, especially when I continue to hear that rhetoric of, an endless commitment that there's no discussion of that, and that's what I find really disturbing about our current predicament.
If I may, to the question that you asked, Zach, towards the end there, it will be extremely easy, assuming that some kind of diplomacy is happening, if the United States and if Joe Biden can say, you know what, I brokered an end to the war in Ukraine, and parts of Ukraine are now effectively or openly under Russian control. I'm a peacemaker. People in America would love that. I think, just from a political point of view, because everybody knows that Ukraine is not in the, essential national security interests of the United States. A fairly stable Europe is. But if Biden presides over an end to this war, nobody cares what he said right up until the minute that the peace papers are signed.
And it is kind of like, a lesson learned somewhat. Like, that's part of this, right, is that you don't want to send the message that a power like Russia can invade a sovereign country like Ukraine and pay no cost. They have paid a cost. They've paid a very high cost. And part of the agreement, can be continuing to pay that cost. But I think you're right that that there is a way to bring, be the peacemaker, run in 2024 as the peacemaker president, and I think that would be at this point in our kind of fiscal domestic situation, that would be a powerful message.
So, since Zach brought up the fiscal aspect here, I want to ask you, Catherine, what you think about the finances here. Another $500 million is, in the scheme of a $6 trillion federal budget, honestly not all that much money. But it is on top of about $113 billion or so in various forms of aid, military and non-military, that Congress has already approved. And as the White House tweet reminded us, this is an unwavering commitment for as long as it takes. That does not sound like this is $113 billion and no more. It sounds like there's a lot more coming. What do you think of this, and how should we be thinking about the fiscal aspect of America's backing Ukraine in the war?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the 21st century, all of America's wars, or proxy wars, semi-wars, kind of wars, I don't even know what this is, they're all forever wars. Like, that's just one way to think about it, is, in the same way that there's this line that I keep coming back to of, don't pass a law unless you're willing to kill someone to enforce it. Like, don't get involved in international conflict unless you're willing to be in that conflict forever. I think that is a rule of thumb that we pretend isn't real. Like, there was when we passed the first and the second and the third and the fourth package of aid to Ukraine, each time there was this fiction, this pretense that maybe after this, I don't know, Ukraine was going to be independent and really just strike out on its own to finish up this war. Like, I don't know what the theory was, but that was kind of the unspoken implication, even though everyone who knew anything about anything recognized that that was not the case. So yeah, $113 billion is a lot of money. And there's no clear path. In fact, Biden is signaling he's not even looking for a path to shrink that number or to bring it down to zero. And I think it matters. There's this sort of phenomenon, right, where when you ask Americans, hey, how can we cut the federal budget? There are a few things that they want to cut. And one of them is foreign aid. And that's a stupid answer because foreign aid is a very small part of the federal budget and the problem is entitlements. But it shows something about where American sentiments are with respect to this. And it's not $113 billion every year for forever. That's not where American people, by and large, end up if you ask them the question abstractly. Now, I do think, as long as it takes, as Zach and Nick have both noted, could easily be until the U.S. gets sick of this, pressures Ukraine to come to a negotiated settlement, and then everyone kind of says, like, oh, we figured it out and it's over now, which, I think that's to some extent outside of the control of the U.S. I will say, I don't know how much we want to get into it, but I talked with some folks here in D.C. this weekend who are not...
You live in Washington, D.C.?
I live in Washington, D.C. And here in D.C. this weekend, I talked to some folks who are not terribly political, but happened to be down on the mall for President's Day. And they bumped into a big rally down there. And they were like, hey, were these your guys? Was this you? Whatever that was, that's not the way out either. Just to be clear, standing in front of a bunch of Russian flags shouting about Julian Assange is not going to solve this problem either. So for what it's worth, we don't have a lot of good options, and I get that.
All right. Speaking of races, contests that don't have a lot of good options, let's talk about the GOP presidential race. On the other side of the aisle, the 2024 Republican presidential primary is heating up with a new entrant into the field and some revealing sniping between the players and expected players. So we're going to name this segment after the widely recognized modern classic Adam Sandler movie, Little Nicky. Yes, folks, that's right. Nikki Haley, the former governor of South Carolina and U.S. ambassador to the UN, is officially running for president. Haley has been swimming in GOP waters for well over a decade, but she's running on a theme of welcome to the next generation. Over the weekend, she tweeted out, "We keep hearing the same thing across the country. Americans are tired of the status quo. They want a leader with fresh ideas and a track record of success." Nick, you're tired of this status quo, aren't you?
Yeah.
So what, if anything, what does Haley bring to the GOP race? Is she really the next generation of Republican?
No, and I would have named this section Darling Nikki rather than Little Nikki. Peter, you wouldn't even have had to change the spelling of her name.
I'll ask for submissions next time.
Yeah, I think that would be a good thing, and bury him in them.
We're gonna do a segment naming contest.
What Nikki Haley brings is a completely forgotten record as a two-term governor of South Carolina, where, according to the Cato Institute, she increased outlays or oversaw an increase in outlays of 38%. And in 2016, the last time they did their gubernatorial scorecard when she was in office was a D. From a libertarian perspective, there's not a lot in Nikki Haley. She left office, worked for Donald Trump at the UN for a while, and had a semi-acrimonious break with him about that, but not so much. I mean, she's, give her credit for getting out there first, but she, as far as I can tell, other than the shot that people over 75 in politics should have to go through some kind of reading comprehension or mental competency test, she's added very little to the discourse, and I predict she'll early in, early out.
Zach, normally I play the role of Florida man on this podcast, but you actually live in Florida now, like today, by choice even.
In
Amazingly.
DeSantistan, you mean?
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean. So, right, you're living under the governorship of Ron DeSantis, who has not officially announced a run for president, but is widely expected to be the main rival to former President Trump. With this early announcement, though, it does seem like maybe Haley wants to play that role too. So how do you see the contrast between Haley and DeSantis? What does that tell us about the state of the GOP field and the race that we can expect to see over the next couple of years?
Yeah, so the comment that I saw her make about DeSantis was, so DeSantis has, famously passed this law here called the Parental Rights and Education Act. Critics call it the Don't Say Gay law, and says, grades K through 3, you can't talk about gender identity or sexuality. And Nikki Haley was like, I think that's really wrong. It should be K through 7. And so it's like, if her strategy is going to be, I'm going to, Ron DeSantis isn't Ron DeSantis-y enough, I really don't think that's going to work for her, because, you can agree or disagree with his policies, but it's pretty clear to anyone paying attention that he's pushing this stuff forward with more force than just about any other politician with a national profile. And honestly, that's also some of Trump's challenge, because he's out there saying, look, Florida actually did lock down for a couple of months, and like nobody is going to buy any of that. We all saw what happened. And, if someone is going to cut a real contrast with Trump and DeSantis, I think you'd want someone who actually wants to offer a path for transcending the culture wars, and also wants to break with the really protectionist and heavy-handed national conservatism that Trump brought into the party, and that I think DeSantis is kind of distilling, that allows a lot of space for the government to shape social policy. And so that is when I will get a little more excited for an entrant into the GOP race, but I'm not holding my breath.
This is about an unwavering commitment to the war on woke, right? The
Right.
GOP candidates are going to fight for as long as it takes
Never give up.
against public school teachers. Okay, Catherine, you may not have noticed, but here's something about Nikki Haley. She's a woman.